By 8:14 on Monday morning, there were 93 unread messages on my phone. Not 93 notifications, 93 separate attempts to reach me. Texts from managers who had ignored me for years. Emails marked urgent in red. Calendar invites titled things like immediate stabilization review and client impact call. 3 voicemails from the same executive who had once walked past my desk without learning my name. The last message was from my old boss. Victor Hale. Mara, we need you on this call. Please, this is beyond urgent. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, wearing an old gray sweater, watching the rain slide down the window in quiet lines. My laptop was closed. My company badge was already in a padded envelope on its way back to the office. My resignation had been submitted, accepted, and confirmed. 5 days earlier, they had given my promotion to the CEO's nephew in front of the entire company. They thought they had passed over one employee. What they had really done was remove the only person who knew where all the weak places were buried. Before the full story unfolds, if you like stories about self-respect, workplace justice, and the kind of consequences that happen when people confuse loyalty with weakness, stay with me. This one is not about revenge in the reckless sense. It is about what happens when a person finally stops holding together a system that never respected her hands. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 36 years old when I finally left North Star Meridian, a mid-sized enterprise software company that built compliance tools for hospital networks and medical billing groups. I had been there for 8 years, which in technology years feels like growing old in a building where the walls change color every quarter, but the problems stay exactly the same. My title was Senior Implementation Manager. That title sounded respectable enough on a conference badge, but inside the company, everyone knew it meant something much broader. I managed client onboarding, translated legal requirements into workflow rules, trained account teams, cleaned up broken deployments, rewrote process documents, handled escalations, answered compliance questions nobody else wanted to touch, and somehow became the person everyone called when a system behaved differently from the slide deck promised. I was not the loudest person in the room. I was not the one executives remembered from off-site dinners. I did not play golf with anyone. I did not post inspirational leadership quotes on LinkedIn at 6 in the morning. I did my work. I learned the clients. I understood the product. I knew the difference between what we sold and what we could actually deliver. That difference was where I lived. I grew up in a house where work meant responsibility, not performance. My father was a school maintenance supervisor. My mother worked in a small accounting office and kept every receipt in labeled envelopes. They taught me that if your name was attached to something, it should be done properly. Not loudly, not dramatically, properly. That stayed with me. So when North Star Meridian hired me at 28, I gave them the kind of loyalty I now understand should be earned slowly. I worked late because clients were confused. I took weekend calls because launches could not slip. I learned every ugly corner of the platform because no one else wanted to. I became the person who could sit between legal, engineering, sales, client success, and finance, and translate 5 different languages into one workable plan. And for a long time, I believed that mattered. North Star Meridian's product was called Clear Ledger, a cloud-based compliance and billing validation platform for regional hospital systems. In plain English, hospitals used it to make sure medical billing rules, insurance payer requirements, audit trails, and internal approvals were properly documented before claims moved forward. We were not handling emergency care. We were not saving lives directly. But if our system failed, hospital finance departments could miss reimbursement deadlines, audit reports could be incomplete, and contracts could trigger penalties. It was boring to outsiders. Inside the industry, it was expensive when done wrong. That was why my work mattered. I built the implementation playbooks. I mapped each hospital network's approval hierarchy. I knew which clients had special reporting clauses, which ones required quarterly audit exports, which contracts had penalty language, and which launch dates had already been promised by sales before operations had even reviewed capacity. There was one client in particular that changed everything. Harborview Health Alliance. They were not our biggest client by revenue, but they were the most important client politically. Harborview had 12 hospitals across 3 states, a difficult legal team, and a reputation for being the client other clients watched. If Harborview trusted a vendor, other hospital groups followed. If Harborview walked away, Everyone heard about it. North Star had spent 11 months chasing them. The contract had been celebrated like a championship win. There were cupcakes in the break room. Our CEO, Graham Whitmore, sent a company-wide email using words like milestone, trust, and next chapter. Sales rang a brass bell near the executive lounge. I remember standing near the back with a paper plate in my hand, smiling because everyone else was smiling, while already calculating how impossible the timeline was. Harborview needed a full compliance migration in 6 months. It should have been 9. Sales had promised 6. Victor Hale, my boss and the vice president of client operations, told me not to worry. You're the best person we have for complicated builds, he said, leaning against my desk like he was giving me a gift. Get Harborview live, and we'll finally formalize the director role. You've earned it. The director role. For 3 years, that phrase followed me like a light at the end of a hallway. Director of Implementation Strategy. It was the role I had been unofficially performing without the title, compensation, or authority. I had asked for it after our first major expansion. Victor said the timing was wrong. I asked again after I rebuilt the client launch process that reduced onboarding delays by almost 40%. He said the structure was still evolving. I asked a third time after 2 directors from other departments started sending their teams to me for all process decisions. He said leadership saw my value, but we needed to be patient. Patience can sound noble when someone else benefits from it. Still, I believed him. Not because I was naive. Exactly. I had seen enough corporate theater to know promises were often made in soft language, because soft language was easy to escape. But Victor had become good at giving me just enough specificity to keep me there. After Harborview, Mara. That's the conversation. After the audit, after the launch, after the board sees what you've built. So I stayed. I stayed through my younger brother's wedding weekend, answering messages from a hotel hallway while my family danced inside. I stayed through a winter flu that had me sleeping with cough drops on my nightstand and a laptop beside my bed. I stayed through 3 product managers, 2 reorganizations, and 1 executive retreat, where they invited every director and somehow forgot the person managing the largest client deployment in company history. Harborview was not a normal implementation. Their billing rules were layered by state, payer, department, and internal approval level. Their compliance team wanted evidence logs for every workflow decision. Their finance team wanted automated exception reports. Their legal team wanted a change control structure tight enough to survive an external review. Their operations people were kind but exhausted, and they had no patience for vendors who arrived with pretty diagrams and no practical answers. I understood them because I listened before I presented. That was always my habit. Salespeople like to talk about features. Executives like to talk about strategic alignment. I like to ask the person doing the work what usually went wrong at 4:47 on a Thursday when no executive was in the room. That was how I built trust. By the 3rd month, Harborview's compliance lead, Denise Rowe, was calling me directly. Their finance migration director, Alan Voss, told Victor on a client call, "Mara is the reason this project still feels possible." Victor smiled like the compliment belonged to him. "We're fortunate to have a strong team," he said. A strong team. That was how my work disappeared. Not in one dramatic theft, but in small translations. My late nights became team dedication. My warnings became general risk management. My documents became department assets. My judgment became something leadership assumed would always be available, like electricity. I did not notice how heavy that invisibility had become until they asked me to train Ethan Whitmore. Ethan was 29, polished, friendly, and newly hired as a strategic operations lead. He was also the CEO's nephew. To be fair, Ethan was not a bad person. That matters. It would be easier to tell this story if he had been arrogant from the beginning, if he had strutted in and insulted everyone, if he had made himself impossible to like. But he was not like that. He remembered birthdays, he laughed easily, he asked decent questions. He sent thank you messages after meetings. He was charming in the way people can be when they have never had to wonder whether the room wanted them. He had worked for 3 years at a consulting firm where his main responsibility seemed to have been making clean decks about systems other people actually understood. Victor introduced him to me on a Tuesday morning. "Mara, I want Ethan shadowing you on Harborview," he said. "He's going to be getting more leadership exposure, and this project is a perfect learning environment." I remember that phrase, learning environment. Harborview was not a learning environment. It was a live contract with penalty clauses, legal oversight, and a client team already skeptical because sales had overpromised. But I nodded, because by then, I had mastered the professional nod. The one that says, I hear you, even when what you mean is, this is a terrible idea and we both know it. Ethan tried. He really did. But he did not understand implementation at the level Harborview required. He confused workflow exceptions with product defects. He treated contract clauses like preferences. He spoke confidently in meetings, then messaged me afterward asking what several terms meant. He liked the visible parts of leadership, the client calls, the executive summaries, the status updates. He did not like the parts where you sat alone with a spreadsheet at 10:30 p.m. tracing why one hospital's approval chain kept breaking for oncology claims above a certain threshold. I trained him anyway. I gave him my old onboarding guides. I walked him through client risk registers. I explained how Harborview's legal requirements differed from our standard template. I showed him where to find the approved documentation. I warned him 3 separate times that the biggest danger was not the core platform. It was the manual exception process Harborview needed during their first quarter after launch. That process was fragile. We had requested additional engineering support to automate parts of it. The request was deferred. We had asked for a second implementation lead to cross-train. Denied. We had recommended extending the launch by 6 weeks. Sales refused. We had flagged that if too much knowledge remained with one person, the project created operational risk. Victor told me not to be dramatic. I put all of it in writing, not because I was planning anything, not because I wanted a trap. Documentation was simply how I worked. My mother's envelope system had become my version control habit. Every major risk had a date, owner, impact rating, and recommended mitigation. Every decision had meeting notes. Every client requirement was stored in the approved project workspace. Every unanswered warning was politely repeated in follow-up emails. At the time, I thought I was protecting the company. I did not realize I was also protecting myself. The betrayal happened on a Thursday. It was supposed to be a routine all-hands meeting, the kind where finance shares revenue charts no one can read, HR announces wellness initiatives no one has time to use, and leadership says transparent communication while revealing almost nothing. I joined from conference room 4B because I had a client call immediately afterward and wanted a quiet space. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and dry erase markers. On the screen, Graham Whitmore appeared from the executive floor, smiling in front of a blurred background that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Victor sat beside him. So did Chief People Officer Lila Mercer and 2 board members I recognized from quarterly reviews. That was my first warning. Board members did not attend ordinary all-hands meetings. Graham began with the Harborview contract. He spoke about how successful the implementation had been so far, how strategic the relationship was, how the next phase would define North Star's reputation in the healthcare compliance space. I sat straighter. My heart began doing that foolish, hopeful thing it had done too many times. Then he said, as we scale into this next phase, we need leadership that can carry this work forward at a more visible strategic level. Victor looked down at his notes. I should have known then. Graham continued. I'm pleased to announce that Ethan Whitmore will be stepping into the newly created role of Director of Implementation Strategy, effective immediately. There are moments when sound does not disappear, but stretches. The clapping started before I understood what had happened. Little squares on the video call lit up. People smiled. Ethan appeared on screen, surprised but not shocked, which told me he had known before the meeting. His face was pink with nerves and pride. I stared at the words in the chat. Congratulations, Ethan. Well deserved. Excited for your leadership. Someone wrote, couldn't think of a better person. That one made my hands go cold. Victor did not look at the camera. Graham said Ethan's cross-functional leadership and fresh strategic perspective made him ideal to lead the Harborview expansion. Then, because corporate humiliation often comes with decorative ribbons, he added that Ethan would be relying on the strong foundation built by Mara and the implementation team. The strong foundation, built by Mara and the team. My name appeared just long enough to confirm I had been useful, not enough to confirm I had been worthy. My phone buzzed under the conference table. It was a message from Priya, one of our senior analysts. Mara, what? Then another from Caleb, in client success. Did they just give your job to Ethan? Then Denise, from Harborview, who must have been watching the client-facing announcement draft on her end. Should I be concerned about this transition? I did not reply to anyone. I sat there while Ethan gave a short speech about being humbled and excited to learn from everyone. He thanked Graham. He thanked Victor. He thanked the whole implementation crew. He did not thank me by name. Again, I do not think he meant it cruelly. That almost made it worse. When the meeting ended, I remained in conference room 4B for a full minute, looking at my reflection in the dark screen. My face looked calm. That surprised me. I had imagined that if a moment like this came, I would cry or argue or storm into someone's office. Instead, I felt something inside me gently detach. Not explode, detach. Victor messaged me 3 minutes later. Can you come by? His office had a glass wall facing the operations floor. People could see us, so he kept his posture relaxed. That was Victor's talent, making injustice look like alignment. Mara, he said, gesturing to the chair, I know that announcement may have landed awkwardly, like a tray dropped in a cafeteria. I sat down. It was unexpected. He folded his hands. I want you to understand. This wasn't a reflection of your contribution. That role was the role we discussed after Harborview. Yes, and your contribution to Harborview has been extraordinary. He used that word carefully. Extraordinary. A compliment big enough to sound generous, vague enough to cost nothing. So why wasn't I considered? I asked. He leaned back. You were considered. I waited. He looked toward the glass wall, then back at me. The decision came down to the needs of the next phase. Ethan brings a different kind of visibility. He's comfortable in executive settings. He has board-facing presence. And frankly, we need you where you are strongest. In execution. In the engine room, he said, as if that was a noble place to be locked. I nodded once. He softened his voice. Mara, you are too valuable to move out of the work right now. There it was. The sentence that explained 8 years. Too valuable to promote. Too necessary to reward. Too reliable to respect. Victor kept going. This doesn't close the door. Be patient. Your time will come. Right now, the best thing you can do is support Ethan and make sure Harborview stays on track. Leadership notices that kind of maturity. Maturity. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, what would my path look like now? He blinked. He had expected disappointment. Maybe a little emotion. Not a practical question. We can revisit after the next quarter. What title? What compensation band? What decision rights? He smiled tightly. Let's not get transactional. That was the moment I understood him completely. When I gave the company nights, weekends, emotional labor, and invisible expertise, it was commitment. When I asked what they were giving in return, it was transactional. I stood. Thank you for explaining. Mara, I need to know we're okay. I picked up my notebook. I understand the decision. That's not what I asked. No, I said quietly. It isn't. I walked out without raising my voice. Back at my desk, I did not slam drawers. I did not send dramatic messages. I did not call my mother crying from the stairwell. I opened my employment contract, my offer letters, my last compensation review, and the company handbook. I read everything slowly. My contract required 2 weeks' notice unless waived by the company. It did not include a non-compete. It did include confidentiality obligations, which I intended to honor. My bonus eligibility had already been paid the previous quarter, so there was no unresolved compensation issue. My project documents belonged to the company and were already stored in approved systems. My personal career records included copies of my performance reviews, promotion discussions, and non-confidential summaries of my achievements, which I had every right to keep. I called HR, not to complain, but to confirm process. Lila Mercer answered like someone who had been warned I might call. Mara, she said warmly, I know today was probably emotional. I almost laughed. Probably emotional. These people could turn a workplace wound into a weather report. I'm reviewing my resignation requirements, I said. Can you confirm whether notice can be waived if both parties agree? There was a pause. You're considering resignation? I'm confirming policy. Yes, she said carefully. The company can waive the notice period and pay out required wages through the final day worked. But Mara, before we go there, I hope we can discuss options. I appreciate that. Please send me the written policy. She sent it 6 minutes later. At 4:52 p.m., I submitted my resignation. It was 4 paragraphs. Polite, clear, no accusations, no emotional language. I thanked North Star Meridian for the opportunities I had been given. I stated my last working day would be 2 weeks from the date of the letter unless the company preferred to waive notice. I confirmed I would complete a standard handover of active responsibilities using approved documentation channels. I reminded them that all client materials, project trackers, and implementation notes were already stored in the company workspace. Then I sent it to Victor and HR. Victor appeared at my desk 12 minutes later. What is this? My resignation. His face had changed. Not guilty yet. Irritated. Mara, this is reactive. No. It's considered. You don't resign over one promotion decision. I'm resigning after 8 years of decisions. He lowered his voice. Do you understand the position this puts us in? I looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed the silence to become uncomfortable. Yes, I said. I do. He glanced around the office. Harborview goes live in 5 weeks. I know. Ethan isn't ready to run that alone. I know. His jaw tightened. He heard the second I know differently from the first. Mara, I need you to be professional. I am being professional. I'll provide a standard handover document. Everything is in the project workspace. That's not the same as you. No, I said. It isn't. He stared at me like he was seeing a locked door where a hallway used to be. The next morning, HR waived my notice. That was Victor's pride, speaking through policy. He did not want me around after I resigned. He thought removing me immediately would prove I was replaceable. He scheduled a 30-minute transition call with Ethan and 2 analysts, asked me to summarize critical open items, and reminded me twice not to contact clients after departure without authorization. I kept my expression neutral. On the transition call, I shared my screen and walked through the approved handover folder. There are 5 main risk areas, I said. The first is Harborview's manual exception workflow for Q1 billing audits. The second is the payer rule mapping for cross-state claims. The third is the compliance export schedule, which has deadlines tied to contract reporting. The fourth is internal ownership of post-launch triage. The fifth is the escalation matrix, which currently depends too heavily on people instead of process. Ethan nodded quickly. Right, makes sense. I knew that nod. It meant the words sounded familiar, but had not landed. I opened the risk register. These items have been documented since March. Each has a recommended mitigation. Several still need executive decisions. Victor cut in. We don't need to relitigate resourcing. Just focus on what Ethan needs this week. I stopped scrolling. Ethan needs those decisions. The call went quiet. Victor's voice sharpened. We'll manage it. I looked at Ethan. He looked nervous now. I could have softened it. I could have done what I had always done, translating danger into language that allowed leadership to feel comfortable. But comfort was what had brought them here. So I stayed factual. All materials are in the approved workspace. I have not retained confidential company or client files. My access can be removed after IT confirms return of equipment. I'll send the handover summary by end of day. I did. It was 16 pages long. Clear, organized, and professional. No hidden traps, no missing files, no spite. At 5:30 p.m., IT disabled my access. At 6:10, a courier picked up my laptop, badge, security token, and monitor. At 7:04, HR confirmed receipt of my resignation and waived notice in writing. At 7:22, I changed into sweatpants and sat on my living room floor with takeout noodles, feeling lighter and terrified at the same time. Because walking away from disrespect sounds powerful when someone else tells the story. Living it feels like stepping off a dock in the dark. I had savings, but not endless savings. I had contacts, but no signed offer. I had confidence in my work, but confidence does not pay rent until someone agrees to pay for it. That night, I questioned myself more than I expected. Had I stayed too long? Yes. Had I mistaken dependency for appreciation? Yes. Had I avoided difficult conversations because being needed felt safer than risking rejection? Also yes. That was the part I had to own. North Star had undervalued me, but I had also trained them to believe I would absorb it. Every time I accepted next quarter, every time I did director-level work with a manager title, Every time I rescued a broken process without forcing the structural issue into the open, I helped build the cage I later hated. That realization hurt, but it was honest. Friday was quiet. Saturday was quieter. By Sunday afternoon, I had updated my resume, sent 4 careful messages to industry contacts, and taken a long walk in the park near my apartment. For the first time in years, my phone was not buzzing with weekend escalation threads. I remember standing beneath a row of wet sycamore trees, listening to water drip from the leaves, and realizing my body did not know how to relax without permission. Then Monday morning arrived. At 6:42 a.m., Ethan texted, "Hi Mara, sorry to bother you. Quick question about the Harborview exception workflow. Where is the latest rules matrix?" I did not answer. Not because I was being cruel, because I no longer worked there, and the answer was in the handover folder. At 7:03, he emailed my personal account. "I know you're out, but I'm having trouble finding the audit export calendar. Could you point me in the right direction?" I forwarded nothing. I replied once, "Hi Ethan. All approved transition materials were provided in the company workspace prior to my access removal. Please coordinate with Victor, HR, or your internal project administrator. Best, Mara." At 7:31, Victor called. I let it go to voicemail. At 7:44, he called again. At 7:58, Lila emailed asking if I would be willing to join a brief clarification conversation. I replied with the same principle. I was no longer an employee. Any work beyond basic administrative confirmation would require a formal consulting agreement reviewed in writing. I would not discuss client details through informal channels. By 8:14, the messages had reached 93. What I learned later was that Harborview's compliance team had requested a final readiness review before greenlighting the next migration phase. Ethan had presented the executive summary confidently. Then, Denise Rowe asked 3 specific questions. Who owned manual exception approvals during the first 30 days after launch? Where were the evidence logs for payer rule overrides stored? What was the fallback reporting process if the automated export missed the quarterly audit window? Ethan answered the first question vaguely. He answered the second incorrectly. He did not understand the third. That was when Harborview paused the readiness review. Not canceled. Paused. In corporate language, a pause can sound gentle. In contract language, it can be expensive. Their legal team requested written confirmation that Northstar could meet the reporting obligations outlined in the contract. Their finance team asked for a corrected workflow map. Their compliance director asked why the implementation lead who had designed the process was no longer assigned. Ethan tried to recover. Victor stepped in. Graham got looped in. Then someone finally opened the risk register I had been updating for months and realized the exact concerns Harborview raised had been documented, escalated, and left unresolved. That was the first crack. By Monday afternoon, the calls were no longer polite. Victor left a voicemail at 1:12 p.m. Mara, we need to move past whatever feelings exist here. Harborview is asking questions only you can answer. Call me back. Whatever feelings exist here. I saved the voicemail. Not to use against him. I just wanted to remember the sound of a man still trying to minimize a fire while asking for water. At 2:30, Lila sent a more careful email. Mara, we understand you are no longer employed by Northstar Meridian. We would like to discuss a short-term consulting arrangement to support transition continuity. Please let us know your availability and rate expectations. That was the first message that treated me like a professional instead of a misplaced tool. I replied the next morning. My rate was $475 per hour, billed in 10-hour minimum blocks, with a signed agreement, clear scope, no direct client representation unless authorized through proper channels, and no guarantee of availability outside scheduled time. I would not provide undocumented verbal memory dumps. I would only review existing approved materials, explain historical context, and identify decision points. That number was not random. It was less than the emergency consultants they would hire from a major firm, and more than enough to remind them that expertise becomes expensive when you refuse to value it early. Victor called 3 minutes after my email landed. I did not answer. Then Graham Whitmore emailed me directly. Mara, I'd appreciate a conversation today. No pressure. I'd like to understand what happened and discuss a path forward. No pressure. That was new. I agreed to a 15-minute call with Graham and Lila, no client details discussed without a consulting agreement. Graham joined from his office. Without the all-hands smile, he looked older, more tired. Lila looked careful, which was her usual expression when legal risk and human emotion occupied the same room. Mara, Graham began, first, I want to acknowledge that your departure has exposed some gaps in our understanding of the Harborview implementation. That sentence was doing acrobatics. Still, it was closer to honesty than anything Victor had said. I said, the gaps were documented before my departure. Lila looked down. Graham nodded slowly. I've reviewed some of the materials. Some, not all. But enough, he continued. It's clear you carried more operational knowledge than was visible at my level. I did not rescue him from the discomfort. He leaned forward. I owe you an apology for that. That surprised me. Not because I thought executives were incapable of apologizing, but because most of them prefer passive regret. Mistakes were made. Communication could have been clearer. The process did not meet our standards. Graham used the word I. I owed him enough respect to hear it. Thank you, I said. He glanced at Lila, then back at me. The promotion decision was based on recommendations I received about the next phase of the business. I see now that those recommendations did not fully reflect the reality of the work. That was as close as he could get to saying Victor had misled him without actually saying it. What are you asking for? I said. Graham exhaled. We'd like you to return. There it was. The door that had been locked for years suddenly opened because the house behind it was filling with smoke. He laid out the offer. Director of Implementation Strategy. Immediate. Reporting directly to him for the Harborview stabilization period. A salary increase of nearly 38%. A retention bonus after 6 months. Public clarification internally about my role in building the Harborview framework. Authority to hire 2 additional implementation leads. A formal review of the decision-making process that led to my resignation. It was everything I had asked for. Almost. That was what made it painful. If the offer had been insulting, I could have rejected it easily. If they had offered a tiny raise and a vague apology, I could have closed the laptop with clean satisfaction. But this was real. Late, pressured, and imperfect. Yes, but real. Graham said, I understand if trust has been damaged. Trust has been damaged. That phrase sat between us. I thought about 8 years of staying late. I thought about the all-hands announcement. I thought about Victor saying I was too valuable in the engine room. I thought about Ethan, probably overwhelmed in a role he should have been prepared for before being handed the title. I thought about Harborview, whose teams had trusted me because I told the truth even when the timeline was ugly. Then I thought about myself, not as an employee, as a person. I need time to consider, I said. Graham nodded. Of course. After the call, I did not feel victorious. I felt split in half. One part of me wanted to accept, not because I missed North Star, but because the younger version of me still wanted the recognition. She wanted the title she had earned. She wanted to walk back in and have everyone understand. She wanted the correction, the apology, the proof. Another part of me asked a quieter question. Why did they need panic to see me clearly? That evening, I went to dinner at my parents' house. My mother made lemon chicken because she still believed food could solve most emotional problems, and my father asked no questions until after we ate. That was his way. He waited until a person had enough strength to speak. I told them everything. The promotion, the resignation, the 93 messages, the offer. My mother listened with her mouth pressed into a thin line. My father leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his stomach. When I finished, I expected him to tell me to take the secure option. My father was practical. He respected steady paychecks and good benefits. He had worked 32 years in the same school district. He understood endurance. Instead, he asked, did they offer it because they trust you? Or because they're afraid? I looked down at my plate. I don't know if those are separate right now. They are, he said. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. When people only become kind at the moment they need you, pay attention to what made them change. I slept badly that night. The next morning, I opened a message from Denise Rowe at Harborview. It had come to my personal email, but it did not contain confidential details. Just a note. Mara, I heard you've moved on from North Star. I wanted to say personally that your professionalism during our work together stood out. If you ever want to talk about opportunities on the advisory side of healthcare operations, I would be glad to connect you with someone in my network. That message changed the shape of the week. Denise introduced me to a company called Veilbridge Systems, a smaller but fast-growing compliance operations firm that specialized in implementation governance for healthcare and insurance technology. They did not build the billing platform itself. They helped companies avoid exactly the kind of operational mess Northstar had created. Overpromised timelines, undocumented risk, undertrained teams, and leadership blind spots. Their COO, Julian Park, called me on Wednesday. He had read a non-confidential summary of my work and spoken with Denise. He did not ask me to rescue a crisis. He did not ask for secrets. He asked how I thought implementation teams should be structured so expertise did not become trapped inside one exhausted person. For 40 minutes, we talked about process ownership, client transparency, capacity planning, and the difference between documentation that exists and documentation people can actually use. At the end, Julian said, "We're building a director-level role for implementation governance. I don't want someone who just knows how to manage launches. I want someone who knows how launches fail before the dashboard turns red." I sat very still. He continued, "Denise said that's you. There are compliments that feel like decoration. This one felt like recognition." Veilbridge moved quickly, but not recklessly. They scheduled 3 interviews. They asked practical questions. They discussed compensation without making it feel like a favor. They described resources, reporting lines, success metrics, and authority. They wanted me to build a small team, create client readiness frameworks, and mentor implementation managers so no one became the invisible single point of failure. Their offer arrived Friday morning. Director of Implementation Governance. Remote first, with travel only for major client workshops. Base salary higher than Northstar's emergency counteroffer. Performance bonus tied to team outcomes, not heroic overtime. Budget for 2 hires within the first quarter. Direct reporting to the COO. Written authority over launch readiness standards. Most importantly, they valued the work before they needed it to save them. That was the difference. Northstar offered me a title because the system shook. Veilbridge offered me authority because they understood why systems shake. I spent the weekend with both offers printed on my kitchen table. I made coffee. I took walks. I wrote in my journal for the first time in years. At the top of one page, I wrote, "What do I actually want?" Not what would prove them wrong. Not what would impress former coworkers. Not what would make the best story. What did I want? I wanted work that did not require me to disappear, so someone else could look decisive. I wanted authority that matched responsibility. I wanted a team that could rest, because knowledge was shared. I wanted to become the kind of leader I had needed when I was 32, sitting at my desk at 9 p.m., waiting for permission to be valued. On Monday, I replied to Graham. I kept the email brief. "Graham, thank you for the offer and for the conversation. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the work I contributed and the gaps my departure revealed. After careful consideration, I will not be returning to Northstar Meridian. I am choosing an opportunity where the value of implementation governance is recognized as part of the foundation, not only during an emergency. I hope Northstar uses this moment to build healthier systems, support the people carrying critical work, and ensure no single employee becomes the hidden structure holding major commitments together." All approved transition materials were completed and provided before my departure. I remain open to a limited consulting arrangement under the terms previously shared, subject to availability and written agreement. I wish the team a stable resolution and continued improvement. Mara Ellison. I read it 3 times before sending, not because I doubted the decision, because some doors deserve to be closed carefully. Graham responded 2 hours later. "I understand. Thank you for your professionalism. I wish we had recognized the full scope of your contribution sooner. Best of luck in your next chapter." Victor did not email me. At least, not directly. By then, Northstar had signed a limited consulting agreement for 6 hours of my time through their legal department. I agreed to one structured session with Ethan, Lila, an internal project administrator, and a senior engineer who should have been involved months earlier. Victor was not on the invite. That told me something. During the session, I walked them through the location of existing materials, the logic behind the risk register, and the decisions still required from leadership. I did not solve every problem for them. I did not take ownership back. I did not speak to Harborview on their behalf. I explained what existed, what had been documented, and what questions they needed to answer internally. Ethan was quieter than I had ever seen him. At the end, after everyone else left, he asked if he could say something. I waited. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have said your name in the meeting." I was not expecting that. He looked embarrassed, but sincere. "I knew you had done the work. I think I was so focused on not looking unprepared that I let people talk like I built something I didn't build." That was the first time I felt sorry for him. Not enough to excuse the decision, but enough to separate him from the machinery that had placed him there. "Ethan," I said, "you were put into a role without the preparation or structure you needed. That's not all on you, but leadership means correcting the record when you benefit from someone else being erased." He nodded. I know. I believed he did. Months later, I heard what happened at North Star through people who still worked there. The Harborview launch was delayed by 7 weeks. Not catastrophic, but costly. Harborview renegotiated service credits and required additional readiness reviews. 2 smaller clients asked for reassurance calls after hearing about the delay through industry channels. North Star hired an outside implementation advisory firm at a rate that made my consulting fee look gentle. Victor was moved out of client operations and into a strategic initiatives role with no direct team. Everyone knew what that meant. He was not publicly shamed. He was not dragged out of the building. Real corporate consequences are usually quieter. His budget disappeared. His influence narrowed. His name stopped appearing beside major client decisions. Ethan remained at North Star, but not as director of implementation strategy. Graham moved him into a client communications role where his strengths actually fit. From what Priya told me, he did well there. He was good with people. He just should never have been handed authority over a system he did not understand. Lila led an internal review that resulted in new promotion documentation rules, mandatory succession plans for critical roles, and a requirement that major project risk registers be reviewed at the executive level instead of buried under department updates. North Star survived. Of course it did. Companies often survive the consequences of bad leadership. They absorb penalties, rename failures, hire consultants, and move forward. But survival is not the same as innocence. And for once, the cost of ignoring invisible work did not fall on the invisible worker. That was enough for me. My first day at Valebridge felt almost suspiciously calm. Julian introduced me to the team by saying, "Mara understands what happens when implementation governance is treated like admin work instead of strategic infrastructure. She's here to help us build systems that don't depend on burnout." I remember blinking hard because nobody had ever summarized my work that accurately in a room full of people. My new team was small, brilliant, but stretched. There was Amara Singh, who could find process gaps in a dashboard faster than most people could open one. Theo Bennett, a former hospital operations manager who cared deeply about frontline users. Luis Moreno, who had the rare gift of explaining technical risk without making anyone feel stupid. I made one promise to myself before I made any promise to them. I would not become Victor in a different office. So I built the team differently. No one owned knowledge alone. Every client had a backup lead. Every launch had a decision log executives actually had to read. Every risk had an owner with authority, not just responsibility. When someone worked late, we asked what had failed in the system, not whether they were committed enough. When junior people contributed, I said their names in rooms they were not invited into yet, especially then, because that is where careers are either built or quietly stolen. 6 months after joining Valebridge, we landed a major contract with a national insurance administrator. The project was complex, politically sensitive, and exactly the kind of work that would have consumed my life at North Star. This time, it did not. We planned capacity, honestly. We pushed back on unrealistic timelines before signatures were final. We brought legal, operations, and client success into the same conversation early. We documented decisions in plain language. We trained backups. We gave people authority before there was a crisis. The launch was not perfect. No launch is. But when problems appeared, they were shared problems, not hidden debts. And one Friday afternoon, when a reporting issue surfaced that would once have ruined my weekend, Amara messaged the team channel. Already found the source. Theo has the client note. Luis is updating the workflow. Mara, no action needed unless you want visibility. I stared at the words for a moment. No action needed. I almost cried. Not because I wanted to be unnecessary, because that was what healthy leadership looked like. Building something strong enough that it did not collapse when one person closed her laptop. A year after I left North Star, I found the old voicemail from Victor while cleaning out my phone. Mara, we need to move past whatever feelings exist here. Harborview is asking questions only you can answer. Call me back. I played it once. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. For a long time, that voicemail had represented the moment they finally needed me. But sitting in my new office, with a team I respected and work that no longer required me to vanish inside it, I heard something different. I heard a version of myself I had outgrown. The woman who would have called back immediately. The woman who would have confused urgency with importance. The woman who believed being the only person who could fix something meant she was valued, when sometimes it only means the company has failed to build properly around you. I deleted the voicemail. Not dramatically, not with a speech. Just one tap. Then I went into a mentoring session with a new implementation manager named Claire, who reminded me painfully of myself at 30. Careful, brilliant, too willing to be useful at her own expense. She apologized twice in the first 5 minutes for asking questions. I stopped her gently. Claire, I said, never apologize for wanting clarity. Confusion is expensive, and responsible people ask before things break. She smiled like nobody had told her that before. After the session, I wrote a note and sent it to Julian, recommending her for a client-facing opportunity. I described her work clearly. I attached examples. I used her name in every paragraph where her contribution mattered. That, more than anything, felt like justice. Not North Star struggling, not Victor losing influence, not the 93 messages. Justice was becoming the person who did not let another quiet worker disappear. People love to say the best revenge is success. I understand why. It sounds clean. It sounds powerful. But I think the truth is more specific than that. The best revenge is refusing to carry a place that only respects your strength when it becomes afraid of your absence. It is leaving without burning the building down. It is telling the truth in writing. It is honoring your obligations without surrendering your boundaries. It is accepting that loyalty is beautiful only when it travels both ways. And it is learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining your worth to people who already benefited from it. North Star once gave my promotion to the CEO's nephew and expected me to keep the system running with a smile. 5 days later, they had 93 messages waiting for a woman they had called behind the scenes. I did not answer most of them, not because I wanted them to suffer, because by then, I had finally understood something they should have known years earlier. My silence was not revenge. It was resignation with self-respect.